So you want to sling spells with the best of them? Let's look into the Laws of Mechanus to learn about spellcasting in D&D 5e. Hello, humanity. It is I, Evans Colton, and this is D&D for the family. Our different YouTube video series cover character creation and role-playing, player and viewer feedback, interviews, and more. Deep dives into tactics, topics, spells, and situations. Pre-game prep for the campaign I run for my actual family. Exploring the rules of the game we play, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Game footage of us playing what I planned in our actual game. Thoughts and reflections on my experience as a GM. Welcome to D&D for the family. Welcome back, D&D family. We're going to talk about spellcasting. We're pulling these rules from the basic rules that you can find for free on DnD Beyond. What this chapter, or part 3 of the rules covers, is everything having to do with spells. Magic permeates the world of D&D and most often appears in the form of a spell. What is a spell? A spell is a magical effort that one creates to change a desired effect, in most cases in a matter of seconds. Spells can be tools or weapons or protective wards. They can deal damage or heal wounds. They can impose or remove conditions. And I find it interesting that the rules say that uncounted thousands of spells have been created over the course of the entire multiverse's history. Many of them are long forgotten. Some might still be out there undiscovered or trapped somewhere in reality, and they might be reinvented someday by somebody who's amassed enough power and or wisdom to do so. Spell level. Every spell has a level from 0 to 9. The spell's level is an indicator of how powerful it is, with 0 being a cantrip or a free spell, and a first level spell being the weakest of the spells, and a 9th level spell being the strongest. The higher a spell's level, the higher level a spellcaster must be to use the spell. Now, it's important to note that spell power and character level don't correspond directly, meaning that a 9th level character cannot cast 9th level spells. A character would have to be 17th level, typically speaking, to cast a 9th level spell. You are able to cast higher level spells the more you level up. They just don't line up one-to-one. Known and prepared spells. Before a spell can be cast, the spellcaster has to be able to hold the spell firmly in their mind. Certain classes, like bards and sorcerers, always know the same spells. Other classes, like druids and clerics, can study or pray or meditate daily to learn a different spell list, but they have access to a complete list of spells from which they can choose to have prepared for the day. And then wizards actually can record spells in their book. They can only know a certain number of spells at a time, but every day they can study the spells in their book and choose which of their spells to know. In every case, the number of spells a caster can have fixed in mind at any given time depends on the character's level. Spell slots. Spell slots have to do with the number of spells you can cast before resting. The rules say when a character casts a spell, he or she expends a spell slot of that spell's level or higher, effectively filling a slot with the spell. So you can think of each spell slot as being a larger sized slot. So a 2nd level spell would be twice as big of a hole as a 1st level spell. Now that means that you could cast a 1st level spell as a 2nd level spell because that spell would fit into that spell slot. But a 2nd level spell would not fit into a 1st level spell. So you can't cast a higher level spell with a lower level spell slot. You have a certain number of spell slots per level, and if you cast a spell in any of those levels, you would burn or use one of those spell slots. Finishing a long rest restores any expended spell slots. Casting at a higher level. So, as we mentioned, a lower level spell slot can fit into a higher level spell slot, and when that happens, the lower level spell becomes the higher level spell. So if you cast a 1st level spell as a 3rd level spell, you're casting that 1st level spell as a 3rd level spell. Effectively, the spell expands to fill the slot it is put into. Certain spells, such as Magic Missile and Cure Wounds, have more powerful effects when cast at a higher level, as detailed in a spell's description. Here's a bonus note from the rules about casting in armor. Spellcasting requires a lot of mental focus and often precise gestures. So if a character is wearing armor, they must be proficient with the armor that they're wearing in order to cast a spell. Otherwise, the armor itself is too distracting and prevents them from being able to focus correctly on the spell to cast it. This makes classes such as Cleric especially interesting because they are proficient with different types of armor and can also cast spells. Other classes like Sorcerer and Wizard have a harder time with this rule because effectively, unless they get a feat, they can't be proficient with armor, and that makes casting spells in armor not possible. Cantrips. A cantrip is a spell that can be cast at will without using a spell slot and without being prepared in advance. It's a free spell, and it just takes the time and components needed to cast the spell. Rituals. Certain spells have a tag saying that they are ritual spells. This means that you can cast a spell normally as you would cast a spell using a spell slot, or you can choose to cast it as a ritual. The ritual version of the spell takes 10 minutes longer to cast than normal, and I do think it's important to note that that means if the spell takes 1 minute to cast and you cast it as a ritual, it takes 11 minutes to cast it as a ritual because it is the 10 minutes for the ritual plus the original time to cast the spell. When you cast a spell as a ritual, it does not expend a spell slot. That also means that the ritual version of a spell can't be cast at a higher level. Something to know about rituals is that in order to cast a spell as a ritual, a spellcaster must have a feature that grants them the ability to do so. The Cleric and the Druid, for example, do have this feature. The caster also has to have the spell prepared or on their list of spells known, unless their character's ritual feature specifies otherwise, as the Wizard's does. The Wizard can cast a ritual spell if it is in their spellbook and they don't need to have it memorized or prepared, which is a really amazing feature for the Wizard. Casting a spell. Anytime someone casts a spell, the same basic rules are followed regardless of the character's class or the spell's effects. Each spell begins with a block of information, including the spell's name, level, school of magic, casting time, range, components, and duration. The rest of a spell entry describes the spell's effect. The exact wording in the spell's description really indicates the intent of how the spell is meant to be used. A lot of times there can be confusion about how spells are intended to be applied, and the best recommended advice is to either use what works best for you or try to make sure that it lines up specifically with the words in the spell about how it was meant to be used. You can also look for sage advice, check out Reddit forums, look on DnD Beyond, search YouTube. There's an infinite number of people that are interested in discussing the gray areas in between how a spell is written and how a spell is intended to be used. Casting time. A lot of spells require a single action to cast, but some spells require a bonus action, a reaction, or much more time to cast. Bonus action. A spell with the bonus action is especially swift. You must use a bonus action on your turn to cast it, provided that you haven't already used your bonus action on that turn. Now, you can't cast another spell during the same turn except for a cantrip with a casting time of 1 action. That rule seems very specific, but it is really important in balancing out action economy, which refers to how much you're able to get done on a single turn. Reactions. Some spells can be cast as reactions. These spells take a fraction of a second to bring about and are cast as your character responds to some sort of outward stimulus or event. If the spell can be cast as reaction, the spell description will tell you exactly when you're able to do that. This is another example of when you would want to pay particular attention to the description as it is written. Longer casting times. Certain spells, including spells cast as rituals, take more time to cast. It could be minutes or even up to hours. So when you cast a spell with a casting time longer than a single action or a reaction, you have to spend your action each turn casting the spell and maintain your concentration the whole time while doing so. If your concentration is broken, the spell fails, but you don't expend a spell slot. If you want to try casting the spell again, you have to start over. Range. The target of any spell has to be within the spell's range. Certain spells are going to target a creature or an object, and other spells are going to target a point in space where the spell will detonate or impact. Most spells have ranges expressed in feet. Some spells can target only a creature, including you, that you touch. That's a touch range spell. Other spells, such as the shield, affect only you. Those spells have a range of self. So a self spell can only be cast on yourself, and a touch spell can be cast on anyone that you touch, including yourself. Spells that create cones or lines of effect that originate from you also have a range of self, indicating that the origin of the point of the spell's effect must be you. Now that means that you can't target a point somewhere else in space and then have the line create from there. Once a spell is cast, its effects aren't limited by its range unless the spell's description says otherwise. And here we come again. Read that spell description and make sure that you really pay attention to what it specifically says. Components. A spell's components are the physical requirements you must meet in order to cast it. Each spell's description indicates whether it requires verbal, V, somatic, S, or material, M, components. If you aren't able to provide one or more of a spell's components, you are unable to cast the spell. Using components and really keeping in mind what you need to use your magic makes role-playing spellcasters much more interesting and much more dynamic. There's a real sense of awareness and preparedness and situational awareness that you need to keep in mind. If a spell has a verbal component, are you able to cast it in front of somebody or in a crowd without being noticed? If a spell requires somatic gestures, then you need to have free hands in order to do that. And of course, if a spell requires material components, you either need an arcane focus or a holy symbol or a component pouch in order to cast it. The component pouch being what holds all of the different components that you would need to cast that material spell. Verbal. Most spells require the chanting of mystic words. The words themselves aren't the source of the spell's power, but it's the combination of sounds or specific pitches and a resonance that pulls that thread of magic and sets it off. Now, this also means that a character that is not able to make sound because they're in an area of silence, for example, somebody casts the silence spell, or if they have something shoved in their mouth, then they won't be able to cast a spell with a verbal component. Somatic. Gestures, articulations, hand motions, intricate finger movements. If a spell requires a somatic component, the caster must have free use of at least one hand to perform these gestures. Material. Casting some spells requires particular objects, which would be specified in parentheses in the component entry. Now, characters can use either a component pouch or a spellcasting focus in place of the components specified for a spell. But if a cost is indicated for a component, a character must have that specific component before they can cast the spell. Now, what that means is a lot of times you're going to see components like a bird feather or a piece of string or a piece of copper wire. But if there is a price denoted next to the item that you need, like a pearl worth 100 gold pieces, or a goblet worth 500 gold pieces, or a copper penny, for example, then you would have to have that item, and you cannot use a component pouch or spellcasting focus to get around it. If it says that you only need a bird feather, you can either use a component pouch or a spellcasting focus like a wand or an orb or a crystal or a staff to cast that spell using your spellcasting focus or component pouch as the material component. It is important to note that a spellcaster must have a free hand in order to access a spell's material components or to hold a spellcasting focus, but it can be the same hand that you use to perform somatic components. So if you're holding a wand or a staff in your hand, as I said, you can use that to make your somatic gestures. If you found this information helpful, please press like, share this video with anyone who could benefit from it, and subscribe to our channel. We value your support. We finish our review of this subject in our next video, #DnDFtF LoM Spellcasting D&D 5e Part 2. Please check out the resources we used in our video, DnD Beyond, Fantasy Grounds, and TabletopAudio.com. DnD Beyond and TabletopAudio.com can both be used for free. Links to the second video and those resources are available in the description below. Please come back and join us again. Until next time, take care of yourselves and try to have some fun.